Welcome, everybody, to the Corporate Governance Through the Life Cycle of an ESOP. My name is Steve Ryan. I'm the Senior Vice President at Great Bank, an institutional ESOP trustee, a board member, as well as the National Chair of the Private Directors Association. We have a great group of panelists here that are going to talk about corporate governance, the importance of corporate governance through the life cycle, whether it be the beginning stages of a new ESOP, to a mature ESOP, to the transitioning of a board. We've got people that are going to tell you stories about the whole aspects of an ESOP. I'd like to introduce Julia McGuire, the co-president of Campbell and Company, is on here, of Campbell and Company. Dan Luzetti, CFO of Hercules. Bart Steffen, CEO of Lutz Bates, and Standy Schumacher of Schumacher Consulting. With that, I'll pass it on to Sandy and have her go over some things that you should know.
Hi, everybody. Well, welcome to this virtual presentation. There is some requirements for your CE. I'm sure you're well aware of those, so you can watch for the guidelines on that. So today we want to talk about really giving you some information to understand what good corporate governance looks like. I think a lot of our companies have corporate governance, but there's always ways to improve that. So hopefully we're going to share some stories and ideas on how to make your corporate governance work better for you. Really think it's important learning from your peers and professionals. So the three panelists we have here are people that sit in your shoes day in and day out and can tell you the good, bad, and the ugly. And then Steve and I have a chance to see many companies across the spectrum. So we'll be piping in with some ideas of what we see as we work with our clients. And then where can you go to ask direction, to direct your questions and share your experiences? We want you to be able to bring those forward, ask questions, and again, learn from each other. So this is, it looks like a very busy graph, we know. But if you're really looking at how corporate governance looks, we're really just, when you become an ESOP company, we're really just adding in one little piece. We're adding in the ESOP piece. So remembering that when we start with the shareholders at the top, once we have an ESOP company, that is the trustee who represents the ESOP. They elect the board of directors who elect officers, who oversee and hire the CEO, who hires his management team, who has the employees, who then come right back into that shareholder bucket. So we just wanted to keep this in mind as we look at how things work and how they interact with each other. Because I think sometimes I get many questions about, well, who do we have to ask the trustee that question, or who's going to make that decision? And I as the CEO, can I just make it? And a lot of times I'm like, yeah, you can just make the decision. So even though this might feel new to you, we're going to help you understand how the decision-making process works. When we talk about the board of directors and what their duties are, they kind of break down into these 5 categories. Once the ESOP transaction is complete, everyone's interests are really aligned. If we look at what the trustee is trying to accomplish and what the directors are trying to accomplish, we're trying to protect the interests of the company and its shareholders. The board of directors, what they really are doing is monitoring, and we're putting that accountability in place to see that if the CEO says they're going to do something, or this is the strategic plan, that someone's actually following along that. There are certain things that are required by law that we have to do as a board. We do appoint officers and monitor those officers and replace them as necessary. But the reason I can tell you that I'm on a lot of boards is to render advice to management. Doesn't mean you have to follow what I say by any means, but your board is there to help you. Your board is there to bring advice to the table, to be used as a sounding board. And as you get to know your board members better, I can tell you, I've got a company, been on the board for 2 years now, and I get a lot more phone calls now that they understand what my skill sets are. And then I'm just there to be a sounding board, to put a fresh set of eyes on something. So that just gives you an overview of why is the board really there? What are we doing? Board engagement, something I learned being a CPA for 30 years. I was in on a lot of board meetings, but I didn't really sit in that director role. And a comment, and you may have heard it, was, but I hadn't, was nose in, fingers out. And I thought that was a really great way to put it as far as a director is. So when we think about how involved is your board should not be involved in the day-to-day operations of your company unless you've invited them in for some specific purpose. Now, there are times where you have a void or a special situation, but it really should be limited participation. We're there to give guidance and make sure the CEO has the resources they need to execute the strategic plan. There are certain things that they have to approve that go through an approval process. But again, those things aren't just being dreamt up by the board. They're usually coming up through the CEO, through the management of the company. From a governing perspective, independent from CEO control. As we're talking here about independent versus inside board of directors or directors, one of the things that the external board members bring is they aren't sitting there inside the company under the day-to-day direction of the CEO. So they bring an independent view and an independent perspective to the board, which I think can be very helpful in the overall scheme of things. I can tell you, I very much feel like a steward, the stewardship of the corporation. Again, we're all trying to make sure the shareholders are taken care of. We also engage in bringing our value, bringing our experience and skill sets to the table. After, again, I've probably seen 100 ESOP companies, and I love the fact that I can bring different experiences to the table and talk about some good experiences and some bad experiences. But either way, hopefully they help the board and ultimately management make better decisions. And then, intervening when necessary. And that's really when you see, a very tumultuous or strenuous situation. I can think of one where the company was looking towards bankruptcy. I sat on the board. I was brought in as they started into this process. Were they going to go into receivership or bankruptcy? And it was really there to help get through that process, understand what was going to be the best decision, because it was really hard for the founder and CEO and director, many different hats there, to really have an independent view of what the right answer was, because it was his own interest as well as the corporate interest. So that external board member helps bring some of that to the table as well. So just thinking about how involved your board is, how involved do you want them to be, and setting those expectations with your board. And I think we'll probably hear some of that from our panelists. Just threw together this list. As you're looking at who your board members are, I think it's really important to have different skills at the table. If you have all financial people at the table or all HR people at the table, you don't get different perspectives. So this can be a resource for you to look back at, depending on what your strategic plan is focused on. Maybe you're going to be implementing a new ERP system. Well, I can tell you, it might be good to have somebody from the IT sector or IT implementation team that's at the board level, because that's going to impact you for a 2 or 3 year period. So just think about what you have at the table that's going to help you most as the CEO and as a board to move forward.
And Sandy, a little quick, when you think about your board too, every person on the board should have a purpose. And that purpose is usually filling a role, filling a void of somebody else some other capabilities that you don't have in your company. So if the company in of itself is looking to do M&A activity, and if you don't have a CFO that has that knowledge or that skill set, then that's a skill set that you want to add to your board. I think those are the keys as you're looking at all the potential voids that you may have. And when you're looking at a board, because you're really looking at that board to be an active participant in the understanding and the running of the company, to help management to be able to give them guidance on where they want to go. The management sets the direction. The board really assists them in where they can. So with that, Sandy, thank you for that. And I think it would be a good time now to transition it to the team and just hear directly from the people that have done this before. And we're going to start off with Dan, have Dan tell a little bit of the story about himself, a little bit about the company, and about really what it takes. And Dan was instrumental in setting up a new board for Hercules. So I thought it would be good for Dan to tell his story. Dan?
Certainly. Thank you, Steve. So my name is Dan Luzetti. I'm CFO at Hercules Industries. We're a steel fabricator and wholesale distributor in the HVAC space. We sell, we make ductwork and sell anything and everything that goes into heating and cooling systems to both residential and commercial contractors of all sizes, ranging from guy in a van to multinational mechanical contract organizations. We've been in business for 61 years. We became employee owned in 2019. So my story with governance has to do with that transition of a family business with very entrepreneurial roots to, it was a good interruption, but I'll call it the interruption of the transaction to employee ownership. And now with it kind of 3 years in our rearview mirror, I feel like we're really starting to settle into exactly what Sandy and Steve kind of outlined. So we were very fortunate. I've been the CFO here for a little over 10 years. And I was very fortunate. We've had a very good board from when I got here. It's definitely evolved, but we had a board and functioned in some of the ways that Sandy highlighted. But I think one key difference was it was definitely fingers in the business in that the board was full of, or seats were occupied by the head of sales, head of manufacturing, the CEO. So it was all, again, the people running the day to day. And I think kind of in hindsight, our governance was really pointed at evaluating decisions after they were made. So it was very much a, hey, we think we're going to open a new branch. And then the following board meeting, it was, how did it go? What kind of, again, a very, very hindsight. And it's a very business oriented family, wildly successful. So I don't have any comments on that approach other than, again, it was kind of in hindsight, board oversight in hindsight.
Would you call it more of a executive management meeting that had some leadership discussion as opposed to a board meeting?
Definitely. I mean, and it was, we strategic planned. We did a lot of things that were maybe forward looking, I suppose. But yes, it was much more occupied by management activity. Then at the point of transaction, I guess I'd share, I don't even know if this is on topic, so to say, but I found it very wildly interesting. So our board consisted of the 4 prior owners, and all of which, again, were actively in the business. So during transaction, they were very interested in kind of the succession planning. How is this transaction going to go? So that was their old board member view. Then during the transaction, they had seller hats on. So they had to navigate the transaction at a transactional level. And then knowing they were going to be the post-board participants as well. So those 3 hats were very different. And I'm very fortunate that those 4 individuals were wildly talented in putting on those hats. But I share it as that's something to have your eyes open to as you enter this transaction, because there's all kinds of viewpoints, all kinds of conversations that were much more easily had and decisions made out of those conversations because we could tangibly ask and know, am I talking to a seller? Am I talking to a previous board member? Am I talking to a new board member? So that was, I think, it's just an important, I don't know if that's a skill set they had, but we definitely benefited from their ability to navigate that.
Dan, I think that's a really important point because I've even had a CEO, say, am I sitting here because they're on the board and they're the trustee in that situation. So which hat do I have on in this conversation? And they, you can't split your brain down the middle. You come to the board as a whole person, but you can change your perspectives as you're having those conversations. And you might ask different questions of the board as a director versus as a seller. So I think you're right on point with people sitting in that reality.
Sure. And then kind of right after transaction, it's kind of just like a whole new world of rules. Oh my gosh, we have to get evaluation. So just the whole process kind of kicks in. And in our plan, we had to bring on 2 independent board members. I think we had 2 or 3 years But wisely, I think we kind of fast tracked that. And we used exactly what Sandy just outlined. We kind of did a self-assessment of the board. So it was myself and our CEO, the 4 new board members that were the sellers, and we had a couple board advisors. And we created this matrix of skill set. Where are we strong and where are we weak? And again, I think wisely in hindsight, we wanted to address those weaknesses in this formality of having to bring on 2 new independent board members, because it was, again, a wonderful opportunity to add expertise. I would share, I think the biggest gain we had 0 lawyers on our board. And I'm really, really glad we have a lawyer on our board now. Just a very useful skill set to filter a lot of decisions you make as a company and as an ESOP, with potential plan amendments and how we're navigating the plan, as well as, I don't know, just again, a refreshing perspective to have in the room when you're talking about acquisitions, when you're talking about new policies, new procedures going into play, et cetera.
So, Dan, does anybody have ESOP expertise, or is that where the attorney fills that void?
No, we actually brought on an advisor who is the CEO of a mature ESOP prior to transaction. And then we also we have a wonderful trustee, and he's also not a board member, but actively participates in our board meetings and is always there for insight. So, but great point, Steve, because that is a unique lens that you need to appreciate. So again, I guess the story there is post-transaction is adding expertise where, yes, it was a check the box. We have to do this because we became an ESOP. We need 2 independent board members, but take advantage of that opportunity and add the expertise you're looking for. And then my last point, now that again, we've matured, our board has matured for 3 years after this transaction, and that's into the formality of structure. We've formed 4 committees. We have a nominating committee, a governance committee, an audit and finance committee, and then a strategic growth committee that's kind of central to like our culture and our business objectives, I guess. But this is where I think we've officially begun the journey to get fingers out and nose in, so to say, to where all of those have opportunities to discuss the business, not be the business. So as a CFO, I use our audit and finance committee a lot to bounce ideas off of, to the formalities of reviewing the projections we're putting forth for the valuation, to the audit committee meetings with our public accounting firm, to the review of the financial statements. All of that, even just by structure, I would share I am much more wildly best prepared for those meetings because I know there's a formal structure that I have to report to. And that means my business is buttoned up. I've considered as much as I consider. So again, it's maybe that's a positive spin on governance, where it's not always, from at least the management team's perspective, of, oh my gosh, there's another checklist, laundry list of things I have to do. There's definitely a benefit to it, and that is in well thought out execution and knowing what you have to execute to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Dan, I will tell you, it's something I definitely see as I transitioned into my consulting company and sit on several boards. I sit on a lot of companies that are brand new ESOPs and have never had a board before, and it does bring a discipline to the table. And yeah, there might be some grumblings about that, and getting people in a routine of, you need to get your materials together, and what are we going to talk about at this board meeting? What's on the agenda? And can we get those out ahead of time so that the board can actually read stuff before you come to the board meeting versus just, coming off at a whim. So it is a struggle with new ESOPs to kind of get that discipline in place. But it's all of these things are, they're required, but they're good business practices. Mm-hmm. Don't you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's hard to transition too when you have a business that's been operating the way they have very successfully to get a little bit more formality. of a board. That is a chance. Putting the committees in place is really should help a great deal, and just formalizing, because then there's each board meeting, or at least every few board meetings, you're going to have a committee presentation about what's going on, what's relevant, and why you want to have them. Julia, Bart, do you have anything that you think that Dan to cover that Dan's not covering, at least in the initial phases? I know Dan, you or Bart, you went through that process.
I was going to comment on the fact that I've learned a lot from Dan, having only been an ESOP for 3 years. Pretty remarkable. I've picked up some good ideas, actually.
Well, very generous. Thank you, Bart.
Bart, anything different that you might have done in the process? So for those people that are considering going through kind of a transition, things that you would have done, saying how could you have gotten ahead to make it, and a lot of it. So for the participants' knowledge, the benefit, there's going to be a whole bunch of people that are presenting very detailed stuff on corporate governance. Our goal here is not to teach you everything. There's other classes that'll teach you that, but specifically, if there's a nugget or two that you think would make some sense for those people that are considering it.
Let me begin just by saying a couple words about myself and Lurch Bates. Can I, Steve?
Yep.
Lurch Bates is a 75-year-old engineering and consulting company in the building industry. And we have knocking on the door of about 400 participants in our ESOP. And we've been in ESOP for 37 years. So kind of remarkable, Steve, that I was able to pick up some of those tidbits beneficially. And I think that we have a very good group of independent outside directors who are really committed, dedicated, experienced professionals that are relevant to our business, albeit we do work very hard in order to try and fill seats on our board of directors with individuals that bring unique skills and experience. There's no question about that. I was quite impressed that Hercules, Dan's company, already has 4 different board committees set up. To be honest with you, we only have 3 of these board committees. Every board generally is required to have both a compensation and to have an audit committee as well as a compensation committee, and we've had those for many years. Works very effectively, but nominating and governance committee is something that we're just setting up right now, primarily because there are some succession issues that need to be dealt with within our organization at the highest level, and that means that our board needs to be very much engaged with that. I guess a couple of things, Steve, to try and touch upon that doesn't step on anything that Dan shared. One thing that we do each year, we have quarterly meetings, but each summer we have a 2-day board retreat. And we go off and spend one entire day where we're really just dealing with very high level strategic planning kinds of issues, outside the box kind of thinking. We bring different people in addition to our outside board directors, and really brainstorm where we want to see the organization going, looking out 5 to 10 years. And then on the second day, we have a normal board meeting, but that's really beneficial. It's challenging in order to find board director candidates that fill that specific void that you're looking to fill. I have to say that. I think one of the challenges that I'll mention that Dan didn't mention at all is how to have a board meeting that is largely made up of outside board directors. So these are not inside executive directors. These are people that really are only deeply engaged in 4 meetings a year, and how to have a board meeting that is something other than a bunch of book reports. So we don't want to have our executives come in and just take most of the day in order to educate our outside board directors at all the wonderful things that we have going on. It's really intended to be, albeit I'll have to say it's quite a challenge, to be like 1/3 presentations, don't PowerPoint them to death, and 2/3 of the day is what we strive to have open conversation on specific issues that are a real challenge for us in the organization. That's not easy. That's actually, but part of that is getting the board material out at least a week in advance, and have information in there that not only provides them with all the financial updates and developments and where we're at on our strategic plans and that, but that it also includes some questions, some very provocative questions that we are going to raise during the board meeting. And we request our outside board directors to come prepared to discuss these questions and bring your insights and experience to the table on those questions. We too have very competent third-party support organizations. Our valuation firm, our trustee, our ERISA attorney, our third-party administrator for our ESOP, all of them. I mean, we've been very fortunate over the years, and it's absolutely critical that every one of them is best in class. And in order to do that, we've had to make changes, and we don't hesitate to make those changes because it's really beneficial for the organization as a whole.
So Bart, you would say that's money well spent? I mean, I know sometimes it's, oh, let's just go for the cheapest, and so why are they best in class?
Well, myself and our CFO, who you know well, Sandy, are, I would be honest, we're pretty demanding people in terms of our expectations of what we expect from third-party providers. And we're pretty quick to identify for them what we expect from them. And when they fall short repeatedly, yes, it is worth the money to get. Best in class are ones that are supporting us to the full extent of our expectations, and our expectations are quite elevated. And I think that that's reasonable. We're representing the interests of almost 400 participants in our ESOP, and we owe it to them for us to get the highest level of performance that we possibly can relative to the ESOP from these third-party service providers. Critical.
Well said. Well said.
Yeah, and Bart, as it pertains to those service providers, who relationships matter. You know, the abilities to relationships, understanding kind of the cores of what the drivers are of the business, how if that open and honest communication, whether it be talking to the valuation firm about everything that's going on to the business and anticipating what may go on in the business, is always really key. To have that, and to have that that comfort that you can share that information with them is really, really important.
Well, Steve, to that point, just real quickly, it's not as though we changed firms recklessly. Our ERISA attorney that set up our ESOP 37 years ago, who we turned to many times throughout the year, as you can imagine, is still with us 37 years later. But that's a world-class, fantastic ESOP attorney that we have supporting our company.
And nothing has changed in 37 years in the ESOP world. Nothing has really changed. It's all basically the same.
Yeah.
Bart, I'd love to, with just a few minutes here, to share, how did you work through the transition of getting the founders exiting the board, or long-term board members exiting the board? How did you address some of that? Because I know you had to.
I have to be honest and say, Sandy, that I think that's probably the most awkward role that I have as CEO, and I'm also the chairman of the board. It is the most difficult thing for me to do. Thank God our directors accept my suggestion that perhaps it's time for us to bring in some new insights, some new blood, and but particularly with founders or former very senior executives who have decided to remain around for a period of time. Just honest, open, transparent, but rather empathetic and caring kind of discussion. I think it'd be a pretty rare circumstance where it would result in a conflict if it's prepared for and handled appropriately. I think in almost all circumstances, it'll go smoothly. But you, again, owe it to the senior management and to all the participants in the ESOP to make the changes that you believe are going to benefit the company and the ESOP. We owe it to every one of them.
Very good. Yeah, it's not an easy situation, especially when you're talking to founders, to say, it's time for you to step off the board, because you're going down a new path.
Well, it's their baby that they've built in many cases.
I'm sorry, Steve.
I said it's their baby. They've built that for most cases, and it's hard for them to let go.
Right.
Certainly.
So, Bart, talk to me a little bit about succession planning and how you guys are trying to manage that. And the other question too is, do you guys have term limits? Do you have term limits as it pertains to your existing board?
Those are both great questions. I actually tried to, we put it to a vote to all of our participants a number of years ago because I wanted to create a 3-year staggered term. In other words, your board term is 3 years, but we don't want to have everyone stepping off at once, so we stagger it, okay? And we put that out to vote to the participants, and it was voted down because we had always voted in outside board directors, all board directors on an annual basis, and we're still doing that today. But I think that there was a concern that if there were issues with a director, that I think that the participants that were voting on that issue felt that maybe 3-year term is too long. I don't believe that it is. You are really do your due diligence in selecting the right candidates. 3 years is by no means too long. Your other question was about succession planning. So succession planning for board directors or for executives?
Well, both, because that the board will be in that responsibility, especially at the C-suite level. For example,
Right.
your succession.
Right. So we work very, very hard. I'll start with executives, very, very hard. Well, we absolutely prefer to promote from within whenever possible. So what that means is you've got to constantly be focusing on bringing in new talent at all levels in the organization and trying to recognize true talent as early on in someone's career in order to get that kind of training and development and opportunities to excel in their career. And I think we've done that quite well because we've been fortunate for all of our senior positions in the company to be able to promote from within. But with regard to succession planning for board directors, it really should not fundamentally be solely on the shoulders of the CEO. I spend a lot of time asking people throughout our company and a lot of networking around the marketplace. And, we don't limit ourselves just to board director candidates who are based here in Denver, Colorado. We're willing to fly directors in from wherever in order to participate in our board meetings. But again, I do find it challenging. I'm not sure that most people understand the sort of characteristics, experience, skills, knowledge that we look for in these board candidates. So it's our senior executives in the company that help with networking around for candidates. But it's worked pretty effectively for us. And as our company grows, and we have been growing quite a bit in recent years, I'm identifying an opportunity for us to expand the number of board directors.
I was going to say, how many board members do you have now?
We have 6 now, and I don't have a problem, by the way, with it being an even number because we don't have votes that come down. If we haven't vetted out an issue thoroughly that we're getting almost exclusively uniform votes on an issue, then there's a problem that needs to be discussed. So, but I'm thinking we'll be expanding it to 7 or 8 board directors in the near term.
Interesting. So one of the things, that comment I would make about the terms, the abilities for a board member to be let go is easy, right? The board can actually vote off a member very easily. So I'm surprised that typically wouldn't be an issue for most. It's a little more efficient and it creates a lot more longevity in. You're able to keep that history and that corporate culture that's important, especially if you have that rotation going. So we're gonna pivot here and get Julia a chance to talk about her and her experiences. Julia, was there anything in particular? First, give an introduction to yourself, your firm, but also if there's anything that you thought that Bart and Dan were missing as it pertains to their conversations.
Thanks so much. I'm so grateful to be part of this conversation. I'm a 22-year employee owner who became co-president of Campbell & Company about 18 months ago. We're called Campbell & Company. We're a professional services firm. We work with mission-driven organizations, mostly not-for-profits, helping them think about how to approach strategic planning, fundraising, executive search, communications about their mission, and also data to help raise the funds to support their mission. We have been growing quite a bit recently. And so founded in 1976, became an ESOP in 1985, 100% employee owned, but we were still run for a long time as a founder organization. The founder who created the ESOP was still on board for another 10 years after we became an ESOP. And then there was a transition to a co-president model. So we're the second co-presidents. That included one of the founders, Edith Falk. Both Don Campbell and Edith Falk were just visionaries in the philanthropic arena, incredible leaders, great leadership. Then over the years, there was additional leadership added to the firm. Peter Fissinger, he became president in 2007 and president and CEO in 2012. But we were still being run very much as a founder organization, very much top down. We had a board that consisted of the executive committee. So talk about the hat issue. We were the executive committee, no, we're the board, no, we're the executive committee, no, we're the board. And so some confusion around those roles. In 2013, we purchased another consulting firm. And with that came questions about the ESOP model, questions about governance. That was when I joined the board. My now co-president, Kate Roosevelt, joined the board. And we really started leaning into the concept of the board and what did governance look like. As we became presence in this fourth leadership transition, a lot of what Dan and Bart have touched on, we have experienced as well. We really went from a passive board to an engaging board, I would say in an excessively rapid amount of time. So we got our first outside board member in September of 2021. And then added 2 more board members in February of 2022. In 2022, we had 9 board meetings as we were setting up all the infrastructure, the committees that you both have talked about. We have a ESOP administration committee in addition to the ones that you have discussed, and then an employee committee, which is most commonly known as an ESOP communications committee. They have named themselves ambassadors for ownership. So not really a board committee, but shares what they're doing with the board. We've updated the bylaws. Bart, you were talking about vendors and that important relationship with vendors. In addition to our board moving from passive to engaging, we've moved our vendors from being passive to engaging, really leaning into those partnerships, relying on them, learning so much. We actually, our first outside board member is chair of our board, acknowledging that what we don't know about ESOPs. We were willing to turn over the chairmanship, if you will, or trust the chairmanship, I should say, to the gentleman that was brought on in that role. It's just been an incredible experience. Dan, you mentioned sometimes moving into the structure. We have hungered for this structure. We are excited to have the agendas, the information out. It's been exciting to be able to share with our staff as we've leaned into the employee owner nature of our company, to share with them what governance looks like. In terms of evaluation, we've had our first formal evaluation of the president of the company, because again, being run in the founder model, that was not something that was officially set up. There's an official way to do that. We are setting up how to evaluate the board. So Bart, to get into that issue of how do you manage board members and have those tough conversations, we are setting up an evaluation process for the board to help us with that work as well. We do plan to move into quarterly meetings. I don't want to frighten everybody about 9 meetings in 1 year, many virtual and some in person. We've enjoyed them both. Really focused on long-term growth as well as the financial stability of the firm. In this same amount of time, we've grown from about 50 employees to about 70 employees and had our highest revenue year this past year. So really an exciting time, and just so grateful to have the expertise of a financial ESOP expert in our outside trustee. And then our second outside trustee is an individual who has a professional services ESOP and has grown that tremendously and is helping guide us through rapid growth. And an example of that is thinking we were crazy not to have a formal HR position, advising, bordering on insistence that we get that role. And I can't tell you, in the 2.5 months we have had that role, the change that it has made in our organization already. So that's just some examples of some of the work. And so you can be a longstanding ESOP, be benefiting financially from the ESOP structure, and still not lean into that structure. So this transition has just been, I think, a really exciting time, helping us to work on the business and not in the business. So a little bit of the fingers, nose, Dan analogy there. So I'll stop there and we can chat away.
So, Julia, talk to me about, you had talked about the board evaluation. Is that the board doing a self-evaluation, or how does that kind of work? I mean, nothing more difficult than to evaluate yourself and and how you're fitting within the team.
Yeah, that's great, Steve. And who we're going to use is our new HR professional who came on board, is actually going to set up the board self-evaluation. So it will be a self-evaluation, evaluating each other as directors and our work together as a board.
Bart, Dan, do you guys do any of that?
We're just beginning it. And I think we tied it to actually through governance, right? So this is a somewhat of a fiduciary responsibility to where if you can establish the process, you can funnel a lot through it. So regardless of situations or regardless of board dynamic, if that process is well established. So, I mean, we're doing it also, I mean, to hear Bart talk about how they're evaluating their third-party relationships. Yes, I mean, we don't have a formal process yet, but we are trying to do just that.
Steve, we during our summer retreat each year, we have an open discussion with all the board directors around the table. So it's not so much individually personal relative to performance, but rather as a group. How could we operate more effectively with the board supporting me as the CEO, but supporting the organization as a whole? And I think part of that, I didn't touch upon this earlier. And it sounds to me from listening to Julia that her organization has this down, but to have an appropriate separation of board responsibilities versus senior management responsibilities. If you have a board that is confused and starts crossing the line into high level management decisions, that can prove to be a real difficulty.
Mm-hmm. I think that was part of the Sandy presentation. There was talking about, intrusive into the business, right? The goal is to observe and guide, not to manage.
Absolutely.
How important was it to any of you to have ESOP experience on your board?
Essential for us. Both of them come with extraordinary ESOP experience. And we did, I think, Bart, it was you who mentioned sometimes it's hard to identify those folks. Dan, you may have felt that way too. But our trustee identified the first individual, got a resume, did interviews. So grateful that our first impression and interview process has played out exactly as we had hoped, maybe even better than we had hoped. And then we had a grid matrix. We talk about being across the country. We really did look at geography, given that we're a national firm, and thought there could be a benefit to having people across the country. So the second individual, since we had the financial aspect, we really wanted someone who'd done it, who had played the role that Kate and I are now playing in stewarding an ESOP organization in this iteration of its existence and preparing it for the next iteration of its existence. So really grateful to have that, but both we had to have ESOP experience.
Yeah, it's interesting I'll ask, who has a single day board meeting? So Julia's.
Yes.
So one of the things that I found, and I'm, as a trustee, I have 25 companies that I oversee, and I see a lot, and I participate in a lot of board meetings, both all my existing clients at least once, and two of them I'm almost at every board meeting. It seems like the ones that divided into two, like you'll have one day of management meetings that'll go over things, and then the second day of board discussion. So that way you can separate managing in the business than on the business. And the board that I'm on, the ESOP board that I'm on, that was the first thing that I instituted was let's separate the two. That way we can identify what's going on in the business and then focus strategically on some of the others. So I'd be curious to see, because I think, Julia, I know you guys do it one day because I've been there. Bart and Dan, talk to me about how your guys' makeup of your board meetings are.
Dan, go ahead.
Sure. Ours are in the afternoon of the first day, is all committee reports. So that's really kind of like the blocking and tackling of the board. That's all the action items we took. So somewhat in a similar fashion to what you just described, Steve. And then the second day, front ended with kind of the management book reports that Bart referred to, followed by the majority of that day is the discussion on those reports, the discussion on what was reviewed in the committees. So it's kind of like the bulk of that second day is where the real kind of meat and potatoes of the discussions are.
For us, Steve, we typically have our board meetings on Fridays. People are flying in Thursday night. We have dinner together with the board directors, and then we spend the whole day Friday meeting from 8 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon. But every one of the senior executives in our company knows that on board week that there's no travel, because we are spending days and days as an executive group preparing for the board meeting that's going to occur on Friday. And that seems to work pretty effectively for us.
Well, I will pipe in. So it was really interesting to me, especially in these couple ESOPs that are brand new, have never had real board meetings before. One was like, well, that's just like an hour, right? Like your board meeting is like an hour. And I'm like, no. So there's a lot of education that has to go on to understand, the purpose of it. But it's really interesting because in those situations, I have three that I'm the only external board member. So they all have been talking and working in, and Julia, I like the in versus on the business, right? So they're kind of talking on a daily basis. So they're like, well, what else are we going to talk about? And so I'm really having to like pull them up out of the weeds and say, so my minimum is 2 hours. But I have some boards that's, but we're like Dan, like you said, it took 3 years to kind of get into the groove. And so I just keep adding on more topics and I just have to play the role of asking all the questions. It's not the ESOP knowledge, even I'm just bringing to the table. It's the business knowledge that's, where's our strategic plan? What are you guys doing? What are we doing about this? What are we doing about that? So it does run the gamut out there. You guys sound like we've got 3 good examples here of a good way to approach it. And so there's a lot of new ESOPs that could learn from you guys.
Well, we never run out of things to discuss at our board meetings. I can assure you of that. And as I say, we do have a pretty good separation of management responsibilities and board responsibilities. But just stepping back for a moment to Steve's earlier question, to be honest with you, we don't necessarily need to find outside directors that have ESOP experience.
Right.
Again, we've been in ESOP for 37 years. I hope that the vast majority of what we do in order to manage all things around the ESOP, we do quite well internally with our CFO and our HR leader in particular. But in addition to that, as I said earlier, having really fantastic support organizations behind us. Our board meetings are not really that much around discussing ESOP matters. It's much more about the strategy for the company, what's working well, and what do we need to change, and how can the board support us in that regard.
So do you have a once a year where you're looking at the health of the ESOP, the repurchase obligations, sustainability? Do you have that deep dive into it? Because that's the one thing that I've always recommended is at least having the abilities to know that there is something else there that you have to really figure out.
We're absolutely doing that every year because we need to, we obviously prepare a repurchase obligation study and share that and discuss that at the board level. We also have to make a determination at the board level as to what the annual funding is going to be for recycling or redemption, what have you, of shares. So how much we're going to be spending. Also, how much of it is going as we're recycling in that, are we going to consider segregation of some of the shares? That's always an important consideration for us. And also periodically the consideration of re-leveraging, because over time, at some times in our history, the number of shares that are owned by former employees gets to be a higher and higher percent. And we will go and do a significant re-leveraging periodically in order to have those shares in the hands of current employees who are contributing to the result.
Right. And that's a real key thing, because nothing worse than having somebody that chooses to leave your organization and potentially going to a competitor, benefiting from the hard work of everybody else that's within the organization. We're seeing a lot more mature ESOP companies that have had an older plan really re-looking at their plan documents. I always recommend at least once a year, where you're looking at that plan document saying, is this accomplishing the goals that we really want? Because again, over a period of time, things change. The abilities to adjust the plan is the great thing. You can do it. It's easy to do. It's just, you have to think about that and to think of the domino impacts of that on the decisions that you're making.
You bet.
And Bart, I liked your comments. The other one I hope you do, and I believe you do, is talk to the trustee about the valuation.
Oh, absolutely. We're
We don't care about the valuation.
sitting down with our valuation company here next week, and our trustee is going to be present for the day-long discussion.
That's perfect. And but your point is well taken. It depends on where we talk about life cycle, right? So the life cycle of where you're at in your ESOP, or if you had to reinvigorate, sometimes that's what you have to do. But at the end of the day, and working with you, Bart, back in the day, you really taught this to me, and is you still have to make the right business decisions for the company. And we talked a lot about that back 10 years ago when you and I worked together. Is don't let the ESOP strangle you. It's make good business decisions and understand the impact on the ESOP, and that has stuck with me for a really long time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for as many advantages that ESOP companies have as it pertains to capital, the abilities to especially for 100% S operating without having any state and federal income taxes, it's still a business that you have to manage capital and reinvest that capital, and you have to take advantage of that when you can. It's a balancing act. Either you're going to pay down debt, you're going to invest in the business via CapEx or via acquisitions. Those are the options that you really have with the use of the capital. So let me ask one last thing, because we're running into, I think we got 8 minutes left. So imagine a situation where a board member is not additive or not productive to the board. Have you guys ever ran into that situation? And tell me kind of how did you navigate those waters?
We had a pretty difficult discussion 1 to 2 weeks ago with this banking crisis, that you can imagine we had to bring our board together in order to discuss what we were going to do with some assets shortly after Silicon Valley Bank collapsed. And we had all of our outside board directors involved in the discussion. I'm using this as a bit of an example, but the conversation that was led by our chief financial officer got rather in depth about banking concerns and fundamentals of economics and what's going on in the industry, and what do we expect may occur, what's the level of risk that we're exposed to. And a couple of our outside board directors after the conversation wrote me some emails and said that I feel badly that I wasn't able to contribute to this discussion as much as a couple of others were. And I understand very, very well why they weren't able to, because you'd have to have had a fair amount of experience in dealing with rather sophisticated banking issues to feel qualified to provide advice. So those circumstances are going to occur, but depending upon how much depth of experience on a particular issue that board directors are failing to add value, I don't hold that against them in that regard. But if they are consistently coming to the table without having done some homework and come prepared in order to add value, particularly on those questions that we send ahead of time in order for them to address and assist us in our strategic direction, then I will sit down again and have a conversation with them and just encourage them to be more engaged and more prepared.
Dan or Julia?
Yeah, I think I would add, so we have not yet experienced this, but I think this is why you build the process to where if you have a self-aware board that knows its expectation of engagement, that has been filled with well-vetted candidates, you at least have all that to point back to say, hey, this isn't adding up. And I would imagine it just makes it easier. So if you've established all those things up front, I would hope that the sustaining it and the exit planning and succession planning kind of follow suit.
Julia?
Well, and we're so new at having outside trustees really here that, like Dan, we have not yet experienced that. And I have to be honest, given my experience at this moment, I can't even imagine that, given the help that we're getting. But I do think it's setting up that self-evaluation as a group or individuals within the group or both is going to be very crucial to that. I also think that setting our directors up for success, making sure, as both Bart and Dan have mentioned, getting the materials to them ahead of time, having an agenda. We've mapped out for the entire year what our topics will be, ensuring that the meeting dates are set out ahead of time. We want to make sure that every director has the opportunity to add value by us giving them the information that they need, whether it's asynchronous reading or in the meeting itself. And then we hope that the self-evaluation process and expectation setting, as Dan said, would self-identify when changes need to be made.
And you mentioned process, and a couple things is having those terms is kind of nice sometimes, because it does give you that chance to say, okay, maybe we had 2 terms in 6 years, and now it's enough. And it also allows the director to maybe step back and say, okay, I've had enough. I think it's time for me to go on and do something else. So I do like the terms. And then Julia, you referenced it in the beginning, is the interview process, because having a board that works well together is just so, well, it takes stress off of everybody. I've got a nonprofit board, but there's always the guy that throws out, the absolute opposite of everything we talk about, right? And that can be a good for the board, but can also be very disruptive. So doing a good interview process by the board, by the CEO, by the trustee, so that you have a board that has good rapport with each other. And Bart, and Dan, you both mentioned like the dinner the night before. That's part of what it is not just sitting at the table and cranking through all the information. It's getting to know one another, getting to know the company in kind of a different type of setting. So those other pieces play into identifying issues with board members maybe before you get to where it's an issue.
I think that's so important, Sandy, and I just want to jump on that bandwagon that we do get together at the dinner the night before when we're all together. We've had a few all in-person meetings. We've had some where someone is virtual, whether from that moment of illness or pre-planned virtual. But when we are in the same space, that we do get together, and you're just absolutely right. That connection and knowing that you're all on the same team, rowing in the same direction, is just really, really important.
So we're down to last minute or two. Any closing nuggets or words of wisdom that anybody has that they'd like to share with the group?
I want to share that one of the things that people were nervous about in bringing in outside trustees was losing control of our company, right, and the ESOP. And I just have to share that it's been exactly the opposite of that. It has just been additive. It's been helpful. It's allowed someone who's not in the day-to-day to, Sandy, as you said, lift us up, force us to lift ourselves up. And so the control, that isn't the interest of the directors. The interest, as you said, is to guide and advise. And I just want to share that with anyone who's thinking about this and nervous about an outside advisor.
One quick consideration, Steve, I'll throw out is that we very much want to have our ESOP participants have access to our outside board directors. We give them their email addresses, and if they wish to go directly to a board director for any discussion, we invite them to our summer picnic, our Christmas party, to different social events. We want our board directors to have the ability to interface with our ESOP participants, our employees.
And that's the true level of independence within a board, because then that way they can actually get direct feedback, direct and honest communication. With that, I think we're pulling this all together, because I think we've run out of time. One, I'd like to thank the panelists for taking the time and sharing your knowledge with us. Thank the NCEO for all the work that they've done. Sandy, for all the efforts that you've done in putting all this stuff together. Really want to thank you guys, and we'll look forward to seeing you guys in Kansas City.
Sounds great. Thank you
you
very
guys
much.
for all your time.
Thank you all.